In this episode, we interview Andrea Hales, who is Native American and a Latter-day Saint. Just want to make sure that we all know that she's not speaking for all Native Americans or, of course, for the church. All right. Welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. In this episode, we have a special guest. This is Andrea Hales. Andrea runs a podcast called Tribes of Testimony, where she interviews different faithful Latter-day Saints that happen to be Native Americans. I want to get a little bit of a background from her on kind of why she started this, what the experience is in going through this podcast with the different Native Americans that are LDS. And I think you'll find this interesting in some of the questions that we ask. Andrea, what brought you around to starting your podcast in the first place?
Well, in the year of coronavirus, when everything was shut down, I happened to listen to a lot of podcasts because I was home alone with 4 kids, and I needed a break from them. So I listened to podcasts, and one of my favorite ones in October. So I kept listening to them. In October, he announced that he was going to take a leave for a while. And I was really actually kind of upset about it because I had grown to love his podcast. I had gone back and listened to every episode that he'd put on. So I was laying in bed that night that he announced that, and I was upset. It's kind of funny now. But I was laying there, and the Spirit spoke to me and said, okay, now it's your turn to do a podcast. And I laughed, and I was like, that's hilarious. No. But it said, it's your turn to do a podcast, and it will be Native Americans in the church. And I just was like, no way. But that prompting never went away. So I started looking into it. I was like, maybe I could do this because I listened to enough podcasts. I was like, maybe I could do this. So I polled some of my friends, some of my Native friends that I'd made at BYU. And I started the podcast, and I had a lot of support from my circle of friends here and where I live and from my family. And so, that's how I started it. And I worked on it for a while before I launched it so November and December, 2 months before I launched it. And I launched it in January of 2021. And I've been posting an episode every week with a Native American member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saint. And it's been awesome. It's just been a blessing in my life. And I hope it's a blessing in other people's lives.
So before we go on and any further into the interviews and some other, I think, how do I say this? I'm very interested to find out more about how Native Americans feel of belonging in the church. This is something I'm not aware of very much. There are a lot of Native Americans actually around where I live here in Arizona. Had several of them in our wards, and so I get a little bit of a perspective here and there when they speak up in Sunday school or I'm talking to them, etc. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit more about your background.
Yeah.
You've got your father is a white American pioneer stock kind of guy, right? With Latter-day Saints, right? And then your mom, I believe, was raised on a reservation. Is that right?
Yeah, until she went on the placement program when she was about 8th grade, I think.
Okay, now there's been some bad news about the placement program, right?
Yeah, and
but your situation is different from that.
Yeah, and I am not able to share all of my mother's story, but it was a really good thing for my mom to go on the placement program. And her first family was really good, and then she went to another family, and they didn't treat her very well. And then the third family she was with, I called that mother my grandma. She was one of my other grandmas. So I grew up having my dad's mom and my mom's mom and my mom's foster mom. I called them all grandma. That's how close and grateful I am to have them in there.
So what is it like to grow up in a multiracial family then in as a Latter-day Saint with the perspective of really two very distinct different cultures?
Well, my story is very different from a lot of people's stories. When my mom left the reservation, in a lot of ways, she kind of left a lot of her heritage at that time. Like she left just not her heritage, but her activism, her living
Her
that
involvement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even though she left that, it wasn't really much of a part of her life anyway. Like I know my grandma and my grandpa would see a medicine man sometimes, but I don't even remember them. And I knew both of them. My grandma is still alive and my grandpa, he passed a few years ago, but I don't even remember them being like going to medicine man all the time. I don't remember them. It wasn't like they lived it and breathed it every second of every day. They kind of, I think they were, I'm pretty sure my grandma, and I can't verify this because my grandma doesn't talk about her past, but I think the boarding school changed them. I think my grandma was part of the boarding school, and my grandpa is actually half Navajo. So he already had the different worlds colliding in his life as well. So I'm a very different person than most, even biracial people. I'm very different than a lot of natives who grew up biracial.
What, with the background you have, what do you think there are any different perspectives that you have as a Latter-day Saint being Native American?
So yeah, I actually, after I graduated from college the third time, I went to Washington, D.C. for a summer internship. And then I decided at that point, since I wasn't married, that I would take a job in Washington, D.C. So I found a job. I actually found it with the Navajo Nation Washington office. And I was, that's really actually the only time I feel like I've actually been discriminated against, because I wasn't Navajo enough. I didn't look Navajo enough. I didn't speak Navajo. I didn't grow up on the reservation. My mom didn't live on the reservation. So I actually had a hard time there, even though I wanted to be a part of that. I wanted to have that experience. It was a really difficult thing for me. And I just, so my perspective is different. Like I've been discriminated against because I haven't been Navajo enough.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What is now you started, so you've done probably, how many have you done? 100 or so episodes on your podcast?
I just this week posted my 83rd episode.
83rd. Okay. So just a general feel from the discussions you've had, the interviews you've done, where do you see what are the conflicts maybe that arise for Native Americans and in the church, perhaps? Where do you see the sense of belonging there? Is there are there issues there for a sense of belonging? Is it, I mean, I would imagine there are some obstacles sometimes to integration, right? And how does that work?
Yeah, there's a lot. Most natives who grow up on reservations, that they're just surrounded by that cultural identity. They, even as much as assimilation has happened in Native communities, they're still surrounded this day by all those cultural identities and just way of life. Like a lot of them don't even realize that they are doing it because it's just day to day for them. So when somebody chooses to become a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, some of them have a really hard time letting go of some of those things. And some of them they shouldn't let go of, because the culture is the culture of Jesus Christ. If they go back far enough and look at how that Native culture began in the first place. One of my first guests, we actually did a special episode with him. And he talked about how the Lakota religion is the church, is the gospel, but they don't recognize it as that.
Where's the Lakota tribe?
In North and South Dakota. So
Okay.
yeah, like the Sioux Nation, and he's I forgot, Oglala Sioux. Yeah. So
okay. And so he says that, or you're saying that
no, in his presentation,
okay.
yeah, he actually came down. I met him in person because he came down to do a Religions of the World class at UVU. And so he came down here to Utah to give that presentation. And so I was like, oh, I want to record that presentation. So he did it in my house. He and his wife did it in my house. And that's one of the most interesting episodes. And I didn't interview him. He just gave his presentation. And he talks about how some of the symbols that they use they were based on things that Jesus taught when he came here to America, and they've forgotten those things. So
interesting. Do you have anybody else bring those types of things up, or do you see an ability for Native Americans to bring the teachings, some of the culture they have with them into the church?
Oh, yes. So that's one of the things that I do specifically in this podcast. I ask them to introduce themselves in their tribal way. If they can do it in their language, that's great. And if not, that's fine, because not everybody speaks their language, like myself. Mm-hmm. And some languages are dead. I mean, they don't learn them anymore. So, and then the second part is what you're asking. I ask them, what do they love about their heritage as it relates to the gospel of Jesus Christ? And I hope and I pray that question helps others recognize how their native traditions do coincide with what we teach in the church, that there are so many things that are the same, and we're blessed to have that. So I've had people talk about stories of how somebody has had a story told to them over and over when they were a child, when they weren't a member of the church. And then when they became members, they're like, oh my word, this story that I learned from my aunt, from my grandma, or from my grandpa, or somebody, this is in the Book of Mormon. Or the way we were taught as youth is to pray all the time. And prayer is definitely a theme that I've heard over and over, that prayer is in their native way before they became members of the church, or even as they, even if they were raised that way as a member of the church, they at some point made that connection, that prayer to the one creator, usually they only talk about one creator, is the creator that we recognize as Jesus Christ. There's just so many things. And that's one of the things I love the most about my podcast is we do talk about those traditional and cultural heritage strings that are the same as the church. And I hope that's helping others strengthen their self-identity. Like, I'm a child of God, and I have a unique place in this world, but I don't have to let go of everything. I don't have to wish that I was only a pioneer descendant. I don't have to wish this. I can be happy with who I am because I know who I am. So
do you think that goes along a little bit of what I wanted to learn a little bit more about? Can then the culture, the Native American culture from the different tribes, is that sometimes a testimony booster?
Sometimes, yes. Yeah, totally.
It's a cultural, there's obviously this cultural divide.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a pretty steep cultural divide, right?
Yeah.
Even Native Americans in the United States and other right? Others that are citizens of the United
Yeah.
States. But I can see kind of how if there's an understanding that there's some type of recognition in the Book of Mormon on the principles and in the gospel about some of its principles and teachings, that there would be something that would speak to you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's what I'm hoping to do with this, is to strengthen testimonies by that means, that there is that. So
how much of an identification is there typically with Native Americans with the actual thinking, okay, I have a heritage of a Lamanite heritage? Does that exist a lot? I mean, I went on my mission to Mexico. Some people felt that, some people didn't. But how does that work within Native American community? Is there a strong sense of identity to the Lamanite heritage, or is it just kind of something on the side?
Yes. Of all of my episodes, there's only one who hasn't felt that way. But that's interesting that you asked that as well, because that's one of the fourth areas of my episodes every week. Is I ask them the closing question I ask is, what does it mean to you to know that you belong to the tribe of Israel? And so yes, they feel that identity as children of the Book of Mormon. And even those that may question that, they recognize that that's a trick question. As members of the church, we all should recognize that we are members of the tribe of Israel, because whether or not we come through the bloodline or through conversion, we become members of that. But yes, there's a definitely a pride in being children of Father Lehi.
Interesting. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. What have you learned the most, would you say, of doing all these 83 episodes? What have you learned the most in doing this podcast?
I think the thing that I've learned the most is that we need to share our testimonies with each other. It's Tribe of Testimonies, and we need to share our testimonies to build each other up, to show that, yeah, there's hard times. Yeah. I've had people that have told me that they've gone in and out of the church at different times. But knowing that that the gospel is true and sharing that testimony, it's just a beautiful thing, that regardless of whether or not anybody is Native, we all need to share our testimonies and build each other up, and let Heavenly Father and our Savior know that they matter to us, and we matter, and recognize that we matter to them.
Going just a little bit broader here, what do you see as, again, and this is something where you get a lot of feedback from the interviews, what do you see as a specific struggles that Native Americans would have in the U.S., as an example, and in the church?
It is hard sometimes to let go of some of the cultural things. I mean, there are some things like, I think going to a medicine man for some people was a way of life for them, or even some people might do it still. And my personal opinion is,
I think I'd like to go to a medicine man. I don't know. I mean, I think I'd like to do it. I've got a lot of health issues. I mean, maybe there's something I can be helped with there. Maybe a spiritual renovation. I don't know.
Yeah, but we also have the priesthood in our lives right now. And we know that authority comes through the right channels. And with a medicine man, it could have been corrupted by not going through the right channels. So I think that's a hard thing for a lot of natives to let go of. And I'm not their judge. I'm not the judge in Israel. It's just, that's my opinion. And I think, I think that's hard for some people to let go of. I think that might be one of the really only hard things to let go of, that some people rely on them.
What about the future? I mean, you again, I'm going back to your background where you've got these two distinct cultures in your family, and what does the future look like in being able to merge more together, right? And obviously when we look at things like that, President Nelson is really focusing on in the church about identity, right? And a child of God, especially disciple of Christ, a child of the covenant, et cetera. And that's something that I think is really important, because we can all assimilate to that, regardless of what our background is, regardless of our race, regardless of our culture. But what do you see as a future in the divide that we currently have? Is that something that is going to, is it moving in a positive direction?
I think it is moving in a positive direction, especially like they just broke ground this summer for a temple right outside the Navajo Nation reservation. And in Oklahoma, the church just helped fund a museum for Native Americans. And part of that museum has an ancestry, a family search library. I think the more the church is able to reach out to the Native people, the more the Native people will be able to look out and say, "Oh, I hadn't considered that before. I hadn't seen how the church actually recognizes that we need help in this way or this way," and mostly spiritual help, of course. I think the church does so much good for the Native peoples in general. It might seem small, but I think it's happening, and I think that that's something that our future holds, is that the church is recognizing that. There's a gathering coming up in September in Calgary, Canada, and the mission and the stakes there, they are coming together to help in this. It's like a conference. It's not a powwow. It's a conference to strengthen the Native people in that area and bring them closer to Christ. And it's being supported by those church leaders in that area. And I think, oh man, that is so beautiful. Some of my friends that I've made on this podcast, we've talked about doing something like that, but I haven't done it, and it's happening in Canada, and I'm so excited for them. I think there's a movement in that direction for helping them and strengthening them and teaching them that that they're valuable the way they are.
Do you, this is the last question, actually, what do you have with that identification with the Lamanite heritage? There is the prophecy of blossoming as the rose. And I would imagine you've thought about that, and others that maybe you've spoken to have thought about that. How do you see that happening? What do you think that really means?
Oh, I think that means, okay, so my theory is that one day we are going to have to stand up as Native people and witness to the world. Yeah, the Jesus, the Book of Mormon talks about, he did come to us. And that's the Jesus that we learn about in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Whether or not they choose to follow the gospel principles and direction, I think personally, this is totally Andrea, that one day we're going to have to stand up and witness to it. And so those of us who are members of the church are going to have to help others to be able to have that strength and courage to do that, to that witness. So I think that's part of blossoming as a rose. I think, oh man, there's so many people that I've met and know who they're like the first ones through college, or they're the second generation because their parents went to college for the first time of all people in their family. And now they're doing big things in life, and they're making a difference in the world. And I think that's blossoming as a rose. And I think just being able to have a testimony that they can share with anyone, anywhere, that's blossoming as a rose. My original podcast name title was From Remnants to Roses, because the Book of Mormon talks about how our remnants were scattered and were dark, not because of our skin color, but dark because we've lost the spirit.
That's what I think.
Yeah. And so we're remnants, and now we're not. We are blossoming. We are becoming a movement in the world to just bring good things in the world. And there's others that are blossoming that aren't members of the church, who are just doing so much good in the world because they aren't letting the past hold them back. They're going forward. So that's what I think about as blossoming as a rose.
Great. Andrea, how do I say your Navajo name? You've got it written here for me, and I don't know how to say it.
It's not my Navajo name. Yate is hello.
Oh, it's hello. Okay.
And then, and I can never say my clans the correct way. So
okay.
In fact, I talked to somebody once, and she's like, yeah, I could kind of understand it. So in the Navajo way, we have 4 clans. Our first clan is our mother's first clan, and then our second clan is our father's first clan, and then our third clan is our mother's second clan, and our fourth clan is our father's second clan. So my first clan, like I said, I can never say it correctly, it's Cwic, and that's the Zia or Weaver people, or the hairy people. And then Billigana, which means white man, is my father. And then Sitnat Ginny is my mom's second clan, my mom's second clan, my third clan. That means the Black Streaked Wood people. And then Billigana for my father again. So
your first clan is your mom's first clan.
Yeah.
So those two are the same. Your mom's first clan and yours. So I mean, that's how the Jews do it, right? It's their heritage all comes directly through their mother.
Yeah, matrilineal.
And that's your first one. That's interesting.
Yeah.
All right, Andrea Hales, thank you so much. The name of the podcast is Tribe of Testimonies. Where do we find that?
You can find it on any podcast app, or you can find it at tribeoftestimonies.buzzsprout.com. And I have 83 episodes out there, and everyone is so good and uplifting, and it will strengthen your testimony, whether or not you're Native heritage. Every one of them, I personally believe everybody has a story, and so these are people's stories in a nutshell, and it's uplifting every time.
Well, I'm so happy you're doing this, and it's fascinating to me. I've listened to several episodes, so thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Greg.